Merci.
Thank you. I think that we can begin now, even though we're waiting for another couple of MEPs. But let me begin by saying thank you very much indeed for being here. It's an important occasion for all of us to be here and to have with us Professor Perronne. So, ladies and gentlemen, members of the European Parliament, first of all, let me say a warm thank you to all my colleagues from the European Parliament, without whom we couldn't have held this conference today. So, thank you in a number of languages.
Décoru, excusez-moi, décoru, en lituanien.
Thank you in Lithuanian, hafla in Croatian. Chair kindly thanks the interpreters this evening, who will be interpreting into a number of languages. And this is also being web streamed. This conference is being web streamed. So let me introduce the MEPs who are here present, who have made this conference possible. Christine Anderson.
Rob Roos,
Rob Roos, who I think you all know now.
Ivan Simčić.
Ivan Simčić.
Stasis Jakiliounas.
And Stasis Jakiliounas.
Et Ursula Giofra, qui représente.
And Ursula Giofra, who represents Children's Health Defence in Europe, that association.
Un immense merci d'avoir soutenu cette conférence.
So thank you all very much for having supported this and for working so tirelessly in the Special COVID Committee. So a round of applause to you all for that.
Avant de commencer notre conférence,
now, before we get going with this conference, I would like to give you all the floor. So we have interpretation in English, French, Dutch, Italian, German, Lithuanian, and Croatian, which can be spoken only. So, Christine, floor is yours. 3 minutes. We always have very limited time here in the Parliament.
Yeah, I've welcome all of you here today, and wow, to have such a
microphone for the speaker. It keeps going. Microphone for the speaker, please. We must have a microphone. Thank you.
My mic is not working for some reason. See, it's always the same. They're trying to shut me up. So anyway, yeah, you may have heard things are unfolding rather quickly right now, thanks to our colleague Rob Ross, who raised the question in the COVID committee, and the Pfizer representative, yeah, answered in quite a clear way. So we all know now that people have been lied to. It was a gigantic lie, and on this lie, everything that governments, especially in the Western democracies, did to infringe on people's rights, to take away their freedom, to lock them in their homes, imposing curfews, all of this was based on that gigantic lie. And yeah, I can only thank my colleagues. We are doing an incredible job in this COVID committee. And we will get to the bottom of things, and we will get the answers that the people that you deserve. We will work on that, and we will continue to work on that. But, and that is the other message, none of that would have been possible to do if we did not have the massive, enormous support of you, the people. Because you took to the street, you showed your governments that you will not put up with this and you will not stand for this. And for that, I really thank you and I applaud you, and I will do so right now. This applause was for you, the people. because we can only do so much if we do not have the support of you, the people. And as you may have heard, Ursula von der Leyen, EU Commission President, is now under a lot of pressure, and rightly so. The people have a right to know what went on in these contracts with her exchange of SMS with CEO Pfizer Bourla. The people need to know who they can hold responsible and accountable for whatever may have gone on behind the scenes. So, yes, thank you again. It was your support that kept us going and that made all of this possible. And things are changing now. Their house of cards is tumbling down, and it is doing so rightfully. And you know what? One more thing, though. I am sick and tired of being called a COVIDiot. And I much rather be a COVIDiot than being a gov-idiot. Because that's what all these people blindly trust. Because that's what all these people that blindly trusted their governments turned out to be. And I will say it again, it was never, never ever about public health. It was never about breaking any waves. It was always about breaking people. But, and that's the good news, they failed. It didn't work. And that I am very proud of, and I'm proud of the people that I am so honored to be allowed to represent, and I will continue to do just that. Thank you very much.
Merci infiniment, Christine.
Thank you very much indeed, Christine. Let me give the floor to Rob Roos next.
Thank you very much, Virginie. First of all, I am very much looking forward to the presentation of Professor Perronne. I'm from the Netherlands, and our debates are mostly informed by Anglo-Saxon media and social media. The French world is difficult to get access to.
Microphone for the speaker, please.
Sorry, no mic. I start again. Thank you, Virginie. First of all, I'm very looking forward to the presentation of Professor Perronne. I'm from the Netherlands, and our debates are mostly informed in Anglo-Saxon media and social media. The French world is difficult to get access to.
Microphone for the speaker again, please.
We try again. You're not the only one. You're not the only one. They try to silence. The French world is difficult to get access to because in the Netherlands, in the Netherlands, the most people, including journalists and politicians, don't speak French. I'm learning it, but not enough yet. Sorry, je suis désolé. For me, the reason I have accepted the host of this conference is thanks to the wonderful translators that we have here. We can make everything interesting. We can make a very interesting voice, French voice, accessible for the Dutch audience. From here, I will continue in my own language, Dutch. Het is onze primaire taak als volksvertegenwoordiger.
Well, our key role as representatives of the people, once again, I'm afraid the microphone has been lost.
Vorige week kwam ik in een mediastorm terecht.
Last week, I was in the middle of a media storm because I asked a clear question to the director of Pfizer, and I received a clear answer. No, we have not tested to see whether the vaccine stopped the transmission of the virus. That was the response. So that was the response that I was expecting, and it proves that the powers that be have not informed the public. There's no scientific proof, and without that, people were excluded from society. Some people in some countries were no longer able to earn any money. They could no longer work because they had to stay shut up at home because of institutional decisions. At the beginning of this year, President Macron So, as I was saying, at the beginning of this year, Mr. Macron did explain that he wanted to irritate those who are not vaccinated through his policies. He used a stronger word than irritate. But it was surprising that that kind of language should be used by a president. A lot of people gave in to that social pressure in the end, and young people who were perfectly healthy and had themselves vaccinated, not because they were worried, because they wanted to get their freedom back. And they had been promised that freedom if they got the vaccination. But what was not said was that after 6 months, that liberty would be taken from them once again because the effects of the vaccination would have worn off. This was retweeted and seen by hundreds of thousands of people. It was throughout the world's media, and I was interviewed, and people did thank me. And I got emails, in fact, thanking me. And I think it's good that the truth has emerged, especially as it's flu season again. So disapproval kills democracy at its very roots. How do you see our role within COVID? And I'm very excited to see how the rest of this conference pans out. Thank you very much indeed.
Merci, Rob. Je donne la parole à...
Thank you very much, Rob. I give the floor now to Ivan Simčić.
Thank you very much, Ms. Jaron. Dear colleagues, when it comes to COVID crisis, we know now that we have been lied to since the beginning. The Commission, governments, and pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer presented and promoted their products, the vaccines mostly, as something they are not. Just last week, this was confirmed both by Pfizer and then by the European Commission in COVID committee of the European Parliament. They presented and promoted vaccines as a product that reduces or even stops spreading of the disease. And they knew that they have no evidence to support that since the products were never tested for that. Such a product is not yet there, as Commission stated last week. It's not there. But they did pay 70 billion euros for that, nonetheless. And they did use this lie to make and introduce digital green certificate and to force their product on as much people as possible. They also use this to take our rights away, from our human rights to work, to move, to patients' rights. Citizens of Europe have the right to choose their own therapy, and they have the right to informed consent. They should not be denied any medical information. At the same time, they did everything they could to suppress and cancel cheap and safe solutions, such as early treatments that showed great results when scientists and doctors treated their patients. There was simply no money in this, so it had to be suppressed. Family doctors were not able to do their job. The people in the field, on the front line, with results in treating, were ignored in favor of ideology and marketing in ministries of health all around Europe and the world. And finally, they decided to prosecute these doctors as well. They prosecute Croatian doctors as we speak. for just doing their job, treating their patients as family doctors, with the best solutions they know and have available. Freedom of speech, freedom of opinion were in danger, are in danger, and censorship was everywhere. They prosecuted scientists that have different scientific opinion. Can you believe that? The ones who spoke the truth, who spoke the scientific facts, no matter what. Since the beginning of this crisis, we have been warning the public about irregularities that are happening. And I know now, more than ever, that we are on a right and righteous path. Mr. Perronne, representatives of Children's Health Defense, and everybody else, I thank you for everything you are doing and were doing in relation to COVID crisis. Thank you.
Merci, Ivan.
Thank you, Ivan. Stasis, a few quick words.
Thank you, Mr. Perronne, for being so courageous, because, you know, we're politicians, we're used to things like that, but being a professional, you risk everything, and it's a great honor to be here next to you. I started to get involved in analyzing COVID, what seemed to be a COVID puzzle for me at first. Back in 2020, in April, I listened to Professor Luc Montagnier, late one, who mentioned gain-of-function experiments. I learned about that, and I realized that private institutions, including Bill Gates, finance that, and that could be related to bioweapons, you know, one way or another. Then I found out directly on my own head the censorship. Some social networks blocked me several times. I never experienced that in my other half of the life because I was born during the Soviet times. Then the statistical chaos was evident. The definitions of COVID case, what it is and how it's defined in the member states, the COVID death. 3 institutions related to statistical management, the European Union, confirmed that the only reliable, harmonized statistic related to COVID is excess death, nothing else. All the rest is hearsay, the speculation. Then we met indirectly with Robert Kennedy, and I read his book about the COVID, not only COVID, real Anthony Fauci, Bill Gates, Big Pharma, etc., etc. So, and then I realized that it's not only a COVID puzzle, it's a COVID fraud, scientific fraud. Probably the people like Bill Gates and others use the, you know, these weapons, bioweapons information to blackmail governments, because governments cannot accept that they were doing that, and commercialize this information. Finance, with one hand, vaccination process, with the other hand, invest in the pharma industry and other industry, and it's called, what I learned from Bob Kennedy's book, philanthrocapitalism. So, you know, we realize that it's a very complicated game, but if you go back to the roots of it, it's quite simple, but the scale of it is immense. It's very difficult to believe that the World Health Organization and 200 or so governments could lie to you. But if you accept that someone can capture policy elements in the World Health Organization, broadcast that, and multiply that through 200 governments or so, then you realize that it's possible. And that's a scary thing. So we have faced, there are some progress here in the parliament. My political group didn't allow me to be member of the COVID committee because I asked too many questions. But that's my job, that's what I do for people. And so what I continue to cooperate with the group we started with and continue to work for you in the future as well. Thank you very much.
Merci.
Thank you, Stasis. Thank you for that testimony. And when it comes to these issues, the Land Commission, we can carry. Christian Therese is in the room. Let's have some applause where it's due. Francesca Donato, who's also a member of our committee. Miss Rivasi, who's here as well. I saw you.
Nous avons...
And we have Miss Ursula Jorfi. Sorry. And Miss Niemer, who's in charge of our group, who's present today. Do forgive me. So as I was saying, we have Ursula Jorfi, who's on the Managing Board of Children's Health Defense and is at present acting General Manager. We have Robert F. Kennedy Jr. here from Children's Health Defense, a consultant, and Morgan & Morgan. Mr. Kennedy is a highly appreciated author and has written Crimes Against Nature, a New York Times bestseller, and also big pharma and Gates. So he's been successful in court in numerous times, and particularly took the court Monsanto and DuPont that gave rise to the film that you are all acquainted with. Ms. Ursula Jorfi, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for Virginie Jean for organizing this event, and the team and everyone for being present and listening to it. My heart is filled with joy that we gather here today to celebrate science, science with a capital S. Science that is the real science and made by real science by people like Professor Christian Perronne. And they carry this weight despite of all the attack, despite of all the challenges what it makes them face. Talking for Children's Health Defense, Christian Perronne has written the foreword to the French edition of the Kennedy book, when it is not really supporting his interest and career today, as you can imagine. It's highly appreciated, and all the work what these great scientists are doing today, we couldn't exist, we couldn't work the way we work with rigorous science, with legal actions, with educating parents for the sake of children, without the work of Christian Perronne and all the others who stand up. What's very important today, if we look at the current situation, it is not so nice to be here and speak about science when it really became the center point of our lives. And this is not disrespect to science. Science, if it was supporting society, would have its significant pace, but not the central point. Talking about individuals like Christian Perronne, but we can mention Carey Mullis, who discovered the PCR. We can mention Luc Montagnier, who just recently passed the threshold. We can mention other scientists and doctors like Zuharit Bhakti or Thomas Binder, and several hundreds, if not thousands, who are taking the consequences for themselves to be truthful to science and the cause and the interest of humanity. They could easily earn the celebrity status and the crown of the greedy powers who are abusing science today and who are using that to get sovereignty away from individuals and to get sovereignty away from nations. Goethe said once that if you fall asleep in democracy, you wake up in tyranny. When we experience censorship instead of debate in the area of science and in other areas, other disciplines also of society, then there's something seriously wrong with our democracy. Then it requires us to stand up, to wake up, to speak up, and make sure that we leave a different future for the next generation. Soon we are going to commemorate the fall of the Berlin Wall. Coming from Hungary, from behind the so-called Iron Curtain once, we remember all too well when scientists and brave politicians or brave social scientists and people filled up the prisons, filled up the psychiatric institutions, because they were standing with integrity against the regime. Let's make sure that we don't get back there. Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you very much. Now, this cooperation over and beyond our political origins and over and beyond the French borders is unique, but it reflects the idea we share of Europe. We want to respect the identity of each of its member states. Europe respects our sovereignty and our freedom, freedom in terms of vaccines, of freedom of movement, freedom of expression, freedom of opinion. It's a Europe that General de Gaulle wanted. A Europe based on intergovernmental relations, not imperial relations, a major alliance of all the major Europeans. As he put it, all major men of action were thinkers. They all had the capacity to look inward and to deliberate on the basis of their own opinions. And those were the days. Now there's the mainstream thinkers who decide what is the truth, ministry of truth that it was denounced in 1984 by Orwell. So we have the pleasure of welcoming Professor Perronne. Let's give him a standing ovation, shall we? Before giving him the floor for an hour, and we're going to have some Q&As, let's have a look at what he's done professionally. He's been a professor in infectious diseases and since 1994, in charge of the hospital in Gars. He was fired in 2020 in December. He's worked on he's worked at the Pasteur Institute. He's been in charge of the French Association for Infectious and Tropical Diseases. In 2015, he was the chair of the working group working on respiratory infectious diseases. Then he was in charge of communicable diseases in the Higher Council of Public Health. He was a member of the scientific committee in the Microbiology Research Institute until 2013. He was the chair of the National Council of Universities. There's a European advisory group of experts on immunization, which reports to the WHO. You're also the author on the truth about Lyme disease, hidden infections, and the latest book is 33 Questions That Remain Unanswered. You in France and at the WHO were one of the main experts on vaccinal policy, but since the outbreak of COVID, things have changed, and now you're a man to be written off, to be destroyed. The European Parliament is where debate takes place. It's what democracy is all about. We're looking forward to giving you the floor. You said to the media that in January 2022, medicine is subject to authoritarian diktats that are outrageous. Medicine has to be free. We no longer are allowed to treat people with treatments that work. It's all about big pharma. Professor Perronne, our doctor is still free at present. And please, you have the floor, sir.
Merci beaucoup, Virginie.
Thank you very much, Virginie. Big thank you to all my MEP friends for the invitation. Now, Christine, I'd met in Sweden. I met some of you in Brussels, so I number of you. And Mr. Ross, you had a great interview with Pfizer's vice chair. And in connection with Children Health Defense, the group that was set up by Robert F. Kennedy Jr. So I'm delighted to be here to give you the presentation that I'm about to. But first, earlier on, Mr. Roos commented on the public statements. I wanted to point out that Jean-François Delfrécy, a professor colleague who I knew when he was an intern back in '78, quite some time ago, who was the chair of the scientific committee that was appointed by President Macron to oversee COVID, and at the end he did away with it. And in last July, he had to leave the Élysée Palace. And what were his closing words? He said, looking back, everything we decided had no effect. And it's not me, it's not the theory conspiracists that I am said that. And the vaccine we chose was the wrong one because it didn't have any effect in terms of transmission, nor for protecting the sick people. It's the chair of that committee that said that. Thirdly, he said we shouldn't have simply do away with people's freedom amongst the general population. You're quite right. He's quite right. And we should have listened more to experts and to ordinary people. Those were his final words when he was ousted from that scientific council, the one that saw to the lockdown, that saw to it that people couldn't get proper medical treatment. And then also, you mentioned Bill Gates earlier on, and with a lawyer and some doctor, well, not really doctors, people who are influential in France. We took legal action against Bill Gates in France and in Paris, an account because he came, he had an invitation to France a few weeks ago, and on a major TV channel, France 2, he said any and everything within hours, and the lawyers, the prosecutors kept tabs on what he said. Normally, I should be in the courtroom near Paris in this case, but of course he's not there. He's got his lawyers that are standing in for him. So I just wanted to mention that in passing. So even if you're powerful, one can still be subject to legal action. And here I go with my presentation. And you're in charge of the slide. So next slide, please.
Alors, le Covid-19, c'est vrai que c'est une...
COVID-19 is an epidemic. That's true, but it's a false tragedy. The epidemic has been worldwide and since the start. This is a bit technical. This is the only technical point that I'll make. The difference between case fatality rate and mortality, the first is the ratio between the number of deaths and the number of cases. And to start off with, it was easy to measure the number of cases because there wasn't a PCR test. That's the diagnostic test. And it was only used in hospitals to start off with to confirm cases that were already diagnosed by a doctor clinically with radiological confirmation and lung scans. So we were certain of the number of cases, more or less. So that was the first wave in 2020. We could estimate the number of cases. That was quite exact, and we could measure the fatality. What struck me to start off with, it was very low, and then summer 2020 in France and elsewhere, governments all promoted PCR diagnosis tests. That's polymerase chain reaction And that's a genetic test invented by an American in California who unfortunately died not long before the COVID epidemic. And he always said when he was alive, never use PCR tests to screen people for healthy people, because there's always a percentage of false positives. So it should only be used to confirm diagnostic suspicion on the basis of clinical signs or radiology. But people were saying, well, if your neighbour sneezes, you need a PCR test to go to work and so on. That's what happened. So overnight, the number of so-called cases was no longer certain, because it wasn't to do with clinical symptoms, it was to do with test results, and many of them were false positives. But so we couldn't measure fatality anymore, and that's the main marker of an epidemic. Epidemiologists affiliated to the government won't ever talk to you about that. So we could only measure the mortality, the ratio between the number of deaths and the number of inhabitants of the population. So that was big, despite all the efforts of the authorities in all countries. I saw this in my hospital everywhere. Someone that came into the hospital for something else and was in the hospital because they were ill, and it was named a COVID stay, and that got the hospital more money, and they may well have died of a stroke or pulmonary embolism or cancer or whatever. But if the COVID test was positive, then the death was registered as a COVID death. And what was very reassuring in all of this, it's been going on for about 3 years now, is that the virus variants have been less virulent as time's gone on, and that it's made me laugh right since the first wave, because summer 2020, the media was saying, oh, well, there's this Spanish variant ravaging Europe, and in France we had an Alsatian one, and we had a Breton variant. So every 3 months we had a new variant. But I know what happens with epidemics and viruses, RNA viruses. When they're new, they come from a lab or an animal, and they get transmitted to humans. To start off with, you get deaths, fragile people, as we saw, but we know that when the virus adapts to the human population and vice versa, the virus becomes less and less virulent, and that's happened for centuries, if on TV, because in France, they might say, well, the 8th wave, terrible variant. Well, they've been telling us that for the last 2 years, and that's rubbish. Next slide. So a pandemic, yes, it's a pandemic, but it is a media and financial pandemic. It's a pandemic of fear. What struck me is that the pandemic was only afoot in rich countries which had the best health systems and the best hospitals and had all the money. And then poor countries were saved, were spared. Right from the outset, we've known that early treatments, despite manipulations of scientific publication, most deaths were prevented, so it wasn't that serious after all. And then given the very small percentage of deaths, given the number of cases of vaccine was completely useless. So they told us, well, we're going to save the world with the vaccine, which isn't actually a vaccine. And we shouldn't have ever given authorization for marketing, for trading of a product called a vaccine if there was an effective treatment already. And that's why they demonize hydroxychloroquine, even ivermectin, because if it had been recognized as being good, they wouldn't have been able to market it through official channels. Now in France, Professor Alice Buzyn, who's a Minister of Health previously, in January, February 2020, the epidemic hadn't even got to France at that stage. Already, hydroxychloroquine for decades had been freely available without a prescription in pharmacies, and all of a sudden you needed a prescription. That was even before the epidemic turned up in France. So I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I do have questions there. And then the obligation to have a vaccine, that's illegal because it's still experimental, even though for some vaccines that will have finished. And the Minister of Health said last year, well, it's not true. The vaccines are properly tested. Now they skipped out the animal testing phase, a few tests on rodents, but they all died, and they said, oh, we don't need more. Let's go straight to humans because they're better than rodents. So just in a few months, they came out with vaccines. So normally speaking, you give people information, we've got a new experimental product, would you like to try? Some people say yes. But to impose this in many countries onto people, that's completely illegal. It's against all international and national treaties and so on. So that is a crime against humanity because that is the status that this has, this kind of aggression against people. So it is a corrupt pandemic, a pandemic of corruption. We've seen that a lot, and particularly private advice sold to governments. McKinsey, for example, is well known. And the French Senate a few months ago came out with an official report to attack the government. Macron paid over $1 billion to an advisory bureau for opinions that anyone, any official in the government could have got. Now, what impressed me was that at the same day in Australia and Canada, in Belgium, in Poland, Argentina, the same decisions were taken by governments. So that means that there was global coordination of this, and that was organised by private operators who earned a lot of money. And what's most surprising was that bad countries, in inverted commas, were poor ones that couldn't afford the vaccine, that used traditional medicine, phytotherapy, plant therapy, hydroxychloroquine. They'd used that for years, and they didn't follow the rules. But if you look back on it, they had better outcomes than rich countries. That's the proof. You don't need to look at random trials. Next slide. So, some people said, well, Perronne, he's just making it up. He's a charlatan. Just to remind you that for 15 years, I was president of several official committees on transmissible diseases. I've come up with, not only me, but alongside colleagues, reports for public recommendations for the French authorities, the Higher Council on Public Health, and I've worked with right and left governments for 15 years, working groups on pharmaceuticals. I was president of the official expert group in France on vaccination, and internationally the WHO recruited me as member and then vice president of the ATAGE group, and that is the European Technical Advisory Group of Experts on Immunisation at the WHO. So that's the WHO's Europe, because that goes all the way to Vladivostok, Belarus. It's bigger than the EU, the ex-USSR republics, Turkey, Israel, and so on. So it's a greater Europe. I was vice president of that, and then overnight I'm suddenly a charlatan. Well, fine. Next slide. So my version, if you want my opinion, is there's epidemiology 101, how to deal with an epidemic, to not have a pandemic. You need to isolate suspected cases or confirmed people coughing or whatever. They should stay at home. But we didn't do that. We isolated everyone, people in good health as well. And and now people might say, well, you're mad. But I was the first defender of mask wearing. People have said that I was anti-mask, but when I worked in French hospitals with resistant tuberculosis amongst people that had AIDS. This was happening across the world. People kept on going into the lifts and cafeteria and so on, cross-contamination of everyone. And I said they should be isolated with masks in their rooms if they're contagious. And so I'm a staunch defender of mask wearing. If you're coughing, if you're in the same room, regardless of whether you're a family member or a nurse, that's just common sense. But making everyone wear a mask if you've got no symptoms, that's stupid. And there is no study, random studies in Denmark say that it's pointless. But in France, I was in a school and they made the kids wear masks because there were a few cases in the region. Washing your hands using gel, that makes sense. You should be kept in hospital not for weeks but briefly, and particularly if you're dealing with an epidemic, early prevention is important if there is. So keeping everyone at home, which happened in many countries, including healthy people, that's pointless. Sweden showed that that didn't work. If Sweden had used hydroxychloroquine and other early treatments, they would have been champion of the world. I'm not sure why the Swedish government wasn't in favour of that treatment, but I have to say that in terms of freedom, not mask wearing and being not having to have a lockdown, Sweden showed that group immunity occurred. Asking my opinion, well, there are national, international plans of actions in France. We had already written hundreds of pages of plans. No one looked at them. You need to follow the basic principles according to factual evidence-based medicine and use professionals in the firing line. In France, different elsewhere, but GPs, well, we should have said, don't deal with that, let ill people. Well, what happened is let people alone in home. They then phoned 999 and then they were taken to hospital, and that cut out all these people. That was a big mistake. And then people quote China and so on, good experiences with hydroxychloroquine. Our experts on TV, politicians, ministers, President Macron and so on said, well, no, we need scientific studies, random controlled trials for weeks and months to see whether the decisions we are going to take are right. And at the time, there were thousands of people dying across the world. I looked into this. I worked at the WHO, World Health Organization. I almost wrote an article on WHO documents. I didn't have time. I should have done perhaps, but there were WHO documents dating from a few years ago saying that if there is a health crisis situation, then that's not the time to have long-scale health studies. But if you think things work, pharmaceuticals work, then use them and evaluate them as you go, as they go. Which chimes with the name of Macron's political group, En Marche. And they should have thought of that at the time. Anyway, so lockdowns, mask wearing outside, all of that was pointless. Pharmaceuticals, straight away. Vaccines, you should have 10 years of clinical studies. But this happened just after a few months, and then afterwards we learned that vaccine manufacturers were ordering little glass vials even before the start of the pandemic, and they pretty much had their patents before the pandemic had arrived. And as a decision maker in terms of crisis management, pandemic management, I would say, well, look at what happened in previous epidemics in other countries elsewhere, but no one did anything. Next slide. And then afterwards, when it got global, what you need to do is compare strategies used in different countries in terms of effectiveness, hydroxychloroquine, azithromycin, ivermectin, and so on, or if they're not effective, look at toxicity of new pharmaceuticals. But that wasn't looked at by the authorities or the media, because all you need to do is go and look online at mortality in different countries. You can see comparative sites on a rolling basis, mortality in different countries, and you'll see that those countries who had early treatment rolled out in these epidemics had low numbers of deaths, but those that had lots of vaccination, lots of deaths. You don't need random control trials for that. Good example is India and Vietnam. Vietnam, tens of millions of inhabitants. The first year they had just a few dozen deaths throughout the country. They dealt with it very well. I remember an official Facebook account that was deleted, because Facebook said it was incitement to hate and violence. Well, do you think that's me? Well, anyway, never mind. And so my Facebook account, someone says, well, our minister has come back from the Davos Forum and is going to make people get vaccinated. And then I heard a friend that had gone to Vietnam, and they showed soldiers dragging people to get vaccinated. So their figures shot up. They reacted well to start off with, but they changed their tune, and the same in India. The first year, things were good. They had hydroxychloroquine, vitamins and so on, antibiotics. And then 3 doctors, I think, said, stop ivermectin, you have to get vaccinated. And in those 3 states, the numbers shot up. And then Emmanuel Macron, there was a product developed by the nuclear industry, and this was a mutagenic product that had been tested to see if people that had been exposed to radio waves, that was tested on. But my colleague Martin at the back there, Didier Hout, Professor Hout of Marseille, was part of the first scientific council in the Elysee. Originally, we invited Hout there. President Macron was there as well as the head of Gilead, and they had boxes of anti-Zavir saying this is a miracle COVID treatment, but it hadn't been tested on people. So that's pretty shocking. So it's unbelievable that there was such manipulation where people were forced to have new unevaluated treatments, and treatments that worked were discredited. So what we saw was that the best strategies weren't always the most expensive. And then I pay tribute to Robert here, because when I was contacted by Children's Health Defence to write the preface of the French translation, there were some passages that really struck me, because Anthony Fauci, who's just stepped down, who was the director of the NIS, the US infectious diseases unit, right at the start, he blocked everything that was cheap and promoted expensive drugs patented by Big Pharma, even if it hadn't been properly evaluated, and set up this, the winning strategy. Next slide. And then in terms of how to deal with this, you need independent expertise to avoid conflicts of interest. That didn't happen. I was head of the top authorities in France for 15 years in this kind of decision. Alongside colleagues, I wrote a charter dealing with conflicts of interest. So experts need to declare conflicts of interest. At each meeting, there could be a conflict of interest, and if that's the case, then an expert should give their opinion, but then leave the room and not vote at the end, and that should be in the public minutes.
So I chaired that for 15 years with no scandal, and then after I left, I don't think there are very many people who could claim the same. and with lawyers and colleagues on the Council of State. I raised this, but now there's no vote. There's nothing about the conflict of interest. So a lot of the members aren't members of the Council of the National Health Council, so I don't know what they're doing there. But others like the Supreme Court saying, oh, everything's fine, you know, it's not working as it normally does, but we're in an emergency situation, but we don't really have the procedures there. But what really struck me in the crisis was that President Macron was setting up a new body every 5 minutes. A defense one, there was a war against the virus. There were powers for the parliament. Nobody really knew who the members of the Defence Board were. Everything was secret. Everything was done in secret. And then I was mentioning Jean-François Defrissy earlier. He was replaced by someone else, another board that was chaired by somebody else, I know, and that was all very strange because Jean-François Delfrécy left the first of the council saying that, you know, the vaccine isn't going to work at all. 15 days later, there is the new chair, head of the new council, saying, oh, the vaccine is absolutely brilliant. But the French are awful. They haven't had the vaccination enough. We got to vaccinate everybody, including children. But the expertise is there in all the official institutions. There was no need to set up new bodies, new committees, but and they weren't independent because of Big Pharma. And actually, this isn't the time to start testing things. You have to fall back on expertise and what is known. And next slide, please. So generally, what happens when institutions have to take decisions, you can't ask a group of experts, for example, who have never had to do something like that to take these emergency decisions. But that is what happened. There were committees set up of new people with no experience, allowed them to decide, supposedly, but actually the decisions were taken by others. They didn't have experience in managing crises. And before that, there were institutions that worked independently who then gave their public views, but here very often things weren't published. And justice also has to be independent. That isn't always the case, and that goes at national level, European level as well. And the worst is that there was no accountability, no personal, no accountability now that there were cases where decisions could be taken with no accountability. Now, that began about 10 years ago in the United States. I was on an international vaccines board. There were laws then in the US that were there to protect pharmaceutical companies, in particular when it came to vaccines. It didn't then happen in Europe, but now all these laboratories and companies can pocket billions, but they have no accountability, no responsibility. With remdesivir, for example, the first random study was carried out by Anthony Fauci in the United States, and the main evaluation criteria was mortality. They did it with a placebo as well. Then after a while, they realized it had absolutely no impact at all on mortality. And they thought, well, what should we do? Well, let's change the criteria halfway through. Let's not bother with mortality anymore. Let's start looking at hospitalization instead. And then they say, well, it does reduce hospitalization by a couple of days. Other studies then showed that that didn't happen. But within 15 days, anyway, they got the FDA giving them authorization, and then it went through the European agencies, the French one, etc. And I was really very shocked to see how all these agencies could be so influenced, and that really isn't normal. Now, just a couple of words on France, as we are in France. In 2001, French medicine was viewed by the WHO as the best in the world when it came to medicines, to mortality, to care, and to the social aspects. So we're very, very proud of being French then. And this, before Macron, even Sarkozy, how to destroy the best medicine, the best medical service in the world. Well, all you have to do is to pay enough money to good consultants and then to remove financing, not for everybody, of course, but for hospitals, for carers, for medicine. And then numerus clausus. I don't know whether everybody understands that. It's a Latin term, but it's that you limit the number of students who can go in to study medicine. Because there were people from the French Grandes Écoles, the administrative schools, 20 years ago saying, well, if medicine costs too much, it's because of the doctors, because they're prescribing. So what we have to do then is lower the number of doctors in order to lower the costs. Lots of countries have seen the same. We now have medical specialities that are actually disappearing. We've got GPs, of course, but we're losing psychiatrists, pediatricians, emergency doctors, A&E specialists. And then those who are left are demoralized, they're exhausted. And I know that in certain rural areas in France, you have to wait 6 months to see a psychiatrist or to see an ophthalmologist because there just aren't enough in the region. Next slide. And then the slow death of public hospitals as well. That's another point. First of all, the doctors' powers were removed. Now, I went in 94, there was the head of department, then we had a financial director, we had an HR, there were about 10 doctors. A few years later, there were 30 administrators and 10 doctors who were listened to, but their views weren't really taken into account. And now there are laws in France about the powers held by the directors of hospitals, and they get bonuses if they manage to make savings and get rid of staff, for example. Next slide. Now, for the time being, private hospitals are doing okay, but public hospitals are in an absolutely parlous state in a number of places. The buildings, the medical material as well. They've got rid of hundreds of thousands of jobs. I was the head of a medical service for 25 years. To begin with, there was staff everywhere. We even had gardeners, in fact, but they've all gone now. It's the nurses, the physiotherapists, the auxiliary nurses, everybody have been gone rid of. Now, there is a hospital, the Garches in France, that is really the reference point. When I arrived, there were about 10 physiotherapists for about 50 hospital beds. When I left, there were no physiotherapists. And that is a centre of excellence for people with disabilities. And then, of course, we've got this newspeak, efficiency savings, efficiency improvements. So that means you do the same job with less money and fewer people. And how to get, then we get to redress the balance, and that means getting rid of more money every year, actually, is how you translate that. But there is an awful lot of money for other expenditure. No, I had a secretary who had a sense of humour, said all the doctors and nurses have gone, but every 2 weeks again, there was somebody coming who was in charge, coming in who was in charge of all sorts of other areas. And she had a whole filing system, all these people who'd been taken on by the French hospitals, people who were there to manage, and the managers of the managers and the supervisors of the supervisors. Once I did annoy my director about this because we were talking about these private consultancies or private offices earlier, but if you didn't have the money for the public hospital, but you could pay huge amounts of money to private doctors' surgeries to carry out something. But the aim of hospitals for some years now has no longer been to care. I think this began at least 15 years ago in France, but it was the government of Nicolas Sarkozy that really began that. And Sarkozy said the hospital is a business. It's there to make money, not to look after people. And he really began the slow death of public hospitals, killed them off. Well, we've said we've got this pandemic of the century killing everybody, and Macron was talking about battling and fighting the pandemic. I thought he was going to be doing something about the hospitals, but no. In France, we had half the ICU beds that they had in Germany, and in the first wave, we could say, well, we are going to double the number. In fact, they managed to reduce that, and they got rid of a lot of beds during the pandemic because they couldn't manage it. And, well, I don't know whether I should find it funny, but in the first wave in April 2020, to give you an example here in Strasbourg, because it really was quite shocking, every evening on the television at the news at 8 o'clock, they showed helicopters that were going to Germany, TGV's trains going down to Bordeaux, because Alsace really was very badly hit by the pandemic at the very beginning. The eastern region of France really did struggle. They were unable to keep up with all the cases, and so there were helicopters taking people to Germany and trains taking them to other parts of France. But then later, with a bit of hindsight, you saw that private hospitals had been dealing with ICU and that did have the capacity were not allowed to take the patients in. So manipulation there. So there was a lack of nurses, but those who hadn't been vaccinated were not allowed to work. And there was also the case of GPs who did not want to have the vaccination, and nurses too. Or Macron said, well, I'm afraid the pockets are empty, got no money to pay for this, which is rather strange because dear Mr. Macron gave 3 billion euros to the mainstream media. 660 million, 666 may mean something to some of you. That was in autumn 2020, second amount in 2021, and then a third lot was in January, and congratulating the pro-government media for fighting fake news. But all of that money, and there was only 3 billion for the hospitals over the years. And then there was money for remdesivir and medicines such as that. And then they gave it to the Indians because we didn't use it in France because it was too toxic. And then there was a lot of money spent on PCR tests that were too sensitive with every wave and every variant, there were fewer and fewer severe cases because the virus was less and less virulent. But people kept saying, oh, it's terrible, everybody's going to die. But there were too many PCRs, and then there were the number of false positives. So we had epidemics of positive tests rather than people who were actually ill.
Milliers de classes ou d'écoles en France. Parce que...
Sorry, there's some strange sound coming. But, you know, perhaps 3 children who sneezed, one had a positive test, but on the basis of that, the entire school was closed. And then ministers were saying there's a pandemic in the schools, epidemic in the schools, but actually there wasn't. So Mr. Macron, very generous, though, managed to give 1.6 billion euros to Mr. Bill Gates.
Enter the meeting number followed by pound.
La technique.
Bonjour, monsieur.
Technical here, so that's Mr. Gates listening in then. Well, I have participated in a number of groups drawing up recommendations, and I know some of them weren't very good because there wasn't very good data, and some not based on proof and not carried out by experts. But there are also fraudulent studies published in the Lancet and the New England Journal of Medicine, for example. And then Lyme disease is spread by ticks. And in my book, there's a version in French and in English, I had already said that in journals there were editorials written in these great medical journals, but it was just to protect the American side and not to speak about Lyme disease. No, it's not Mr. Perronne, the conspiracy theorist, who's saying this, but it was in the papers. But there was somebody in the New England Journal, I can't remember the name, not that long ago, who stated this. Also, again, next year, there are a lot of articles in the journal I used to work with who are paid for. They're fraudulent and they're paid for by Big Pharma. Richard Hortet, who is the editor-in-chief of The Lancet, which is very prestigious, wrote a pamphlet against his journal saying it was corrupt, half the articles are false. I thought he had actually resigned. But then when COVID arrived, I looked at the Lancet and I saw that he was still the editor-in-chief, the person who'd been saying all that, talking about fraudulent reports in the journal. So I really found that hard to understand. So, you know, the experience of the doctor and the views of the patient don't seem to count. And then doctors in universities, their views were suppressed. And I had, as I had freedom of expression in my role, but that seems now to have gone. You just have to be like sheep and follow religiously what the government is saying. And then it's a witch hunt against those doctors who don't agree. Now, once again, we have somebody here in Strasbourg who was indeed suspended. I think maybe.
He fought alongside me through many battles, in particular when it comes to Lyme and the various diseases, but he was suspended because he wasn't vaccinated, and he was removed from the French Medical Association. So, Stéphane, you have my full admiration and support.
Je pense que
I think you all have our support. So thank you so much for being here. And maybe perhaps it's others amongst you. Our colleague from Luxembourg, and I forget the name, I recognize you. Thank you. Martin, you got into trouble too, didn't you? Martin Venet, who was from Strasbourg, and doctor, psychiatrist, and I would like to pay a tribute to all of you because you're just a small sample. There's hundreds of doctors, and I really think they deserve our support. I myself, well, I had several get-togethers with the French Medical Board, and in September I had to go to the disciplinary board, and the regional board in Paris. I'm still waiting to be sentenced. I take it that, well, it was supposed to be handed down by the end of the month, but now I don't really care. I'm not ashamed of anything I've ever done. Next slide, please. So another important that it's not just the daily provision of medicine. I realize that well, now it's all about big pharma, and we teach students of medicine that when it comes to the critical reading of articles, they should only take account what's in the major journals, the Lancet and others, the fact that their teachers have experience. And when I was a student and my teacher would say, I've got 20 years experience, I'd have a lot of respect for those people. Now, if I tell somebody about my experience, young people say, hey, what are you talking? Who are you? Show it to me in the Lancet. So all of that is financed by Big Pharma. And not that long ago, well, it was in 1920 that Rockefeller got this whole thing going because he was funding half of the medical universities in the U.S. And it was great for the chemicals industry. It was great to have all those patented medicines. And now what we're seeing is natural medicine, vitamin D, certain plants. Artemisia's banned in France and Belgium. So there's these bans when it comes to other approaches. And when somebody promotes alternative medicines, they're called charlatans. And I said, no, turn it around. Listen and see what the actual results are. Carry out studies. And I said, carry out studies. And then I'm told that the whole disease I'm talking about is imaginary. And as said GPs, they're suffering a lot, and there's ever fewer of them, and they're underpaid and overworked, so they spend less times on each patient, 10 minutes, 15 minutes maximum, and some of them try to make up for the loss to insist on additional and unnecessary medical treatment. And we've got a new health minister, Dr. Perronne. I don't know if it's François Perronne, who's from the emergency department, and it's a real catastrophe. You used to happen to wait 3 hours in emergency services, and now there's major hospitals, university hospitals, where you have to wait 3 days and without food, and you have to wait there for hours to be able to use the men's or ladies' room. So there's nobody in the emergency services. There's a solution. They say if you don't have enough people in your emergency department, you close them as of 7 p.m. Keep them closed overnight. That's what the French Minister of Health has argued. Agnès Buzyn said we have to do, what we have to set up is some super nurses. And I've seen in France, in supermarkets, you have automatic medical advice given to you via a machine. You put your health insurance card in there, and then you're in touch with somebody. And now pharmacists are allowed to provide medical treatment. So far, they haven't been carrying out open heart operations, but they're making all this official. The fact that they're doing away with the genuine providers of health care. Now, IT, that gives rise to some problems because medical secrecy, data banks they use are not secure. Any doctor can have access to that. So the patient can see who's looked into his case and who's going to go see, who's going to do that. I know of a professor of medicine from a major university who was in hospital for a cancer, and when he got out of hospital, he had to look at the medical information concerning him. Half of his students and loads of other medicine students had looked at that, and Macron is in cahoots with international data banks. And in France, I think it's the same case elsewhere, that international data banks are provided with medical data. Now doctors spend more time with their PCs than they do with their patients. And the doctors don't have secretaries anymore. They have to do all the admin themselves. Now, I'd like to compare COVID and Lyme's disease to show you how things have been in that area when it comes to Borrelia burgdorferi, which is communicated by ticks. And it's the equivalent of SARS-CoV-2. There's an excellent book called Bitten, and that's the military archives that were made public by Willy Burgdorfer. He had some regrets late in his career. Normally, those archives would have been destroyed, and he told Chris Newby, I've hid my archives in a garage. Here's the key. And off it went. So this was unnoticed. I'd kept close tabs on this. It was in June 2019, and the U.S. House of Representatives saw that book with all the evidence and opened an inquiry about the Pentagon. Is this true? Is this what you've been up to? So COVID came at a nice time because since then everybody's forgotten about Lyme disease. Here's the book. It's in English, but it's really gripping stuff. It's well, let's compare here Lyme and COVID. When it comes to chronic Lyme, there was denial. And on the contrary, when it came to COVID-19, it was the opposite. It was promoted, and it had to be humongous. And in both cases, bad serologies were put forward. And to see to it that more than 5% of those infected would be screened. And in COVID, well, when it comes to serologies, if they were reliable, then you'd find that most people have antibodies and protected. Even if there can be a benign variant, they don't need the vaccine. So if you have reliable serologies, that's a disaster for big pharma. There's a French researcher, David Mandel, who published in late 2020, a very interesting article where he compared all the serological tests, and most of them were lousy. I got in touch with him via video conference, and I said, this is very interesting. We can go on working together. But he said, no, I've received so many threats, I'm calling it quits. You can believe that, I'm sure. Then when it comes to PCR, because the Lyme disease, there's always the Lancet coming out with fresh articles where they say that PCRs are useless and should be banned, and they're unreliable. When it comes to COVID-19, suddenly these PCRs are terrific, and normally you shouldn't be doing PCRs on people without symptoms. And when it comes to the amplification cycles, the gene material, there's non-infectious particles that are amplified. So you get plenty of false positives. And when it comes to Lyme disease, the epidemic is largely underestimated. When it comes to COVID, we have the opposite situation. I mean, the figures have just been boosted when it comes to the number of cases as well as the number of deaths. And here, another nice comparison between Lyme and COVID. The treatment that works is banned, and the same holds for COVID-19. I mean, antibiotics, hydroxychloroquine, and I know plenty of natural medicines that work. So the bottom line is, if you see an official doctor who follows the recommendations, he or she will tell you, you belong in the psychiatric department, because this is all in your mind. When it comes to COVID-19, there's a ministerial decree saying you should inject clonazepam, and that was tantamount to euthanasia for a lot of patients. I don't mind quoting mentioning my books, The Truth on Lyme Disease, which was translated into English as Crypto Infections. And I go into all these cases of manipulation of data, about also other infections that are low profile, but that do matter as well. So next slide. You mentioned my books. These are the first two. They were both bestsellers. So, and I know that there are high ranking politicians who consulted lawyers to see if they could take me to court. And no, they couldn't. I'm still alive and kicking, and I'm not one given to depression. I say that because there's two well-known people who fell from the 8th floor, and another one who was found drowned. So this is a scoop. This is my latest book. It's coming out on the 2nd of November. Virginie, here you go. It bears my signature. 33 questions that they still haven't answered, and you're entitled to know. And here again, it's all evidence-based, so it won't make everybody happy, but that way I've put together a trilogy when it comes to COVID. So how can we get our medicine back up to the high-quality standard it used to boast? So changing politicians and changing policies, except for those present, of course. So we now know who we want as Minister of Health. And no big pharma, no consultants, no lobbies. And at lunch, I ran through a book by Philippe de Villiers, a former MEP, and in his book, he said that on the door here in Strasbourg, it said, no entry to dogs or lobbyists. And so you have to do away with conflicts of interest between the decision makers. And what's surprising is that it's allowed in the United States. You can have all kinds of money and you can be a member of a committee as long as you make that publicly known. As long as you don't lie, you can participate in decisions even though you're worth millions or billions. That wasn't the case in Europe at the time. It now is. And we have to rehire the caregivers, also those who were suspended. Some countries have, not all. You have to increase the number of students studying medicine, and you have to increase the number of healthcare givers and beds. And you shouldn't reimburse medicines that cost huge amounts of money. There's medicines that serve no purpose and might even be toxic. And when it comes to alternative or natural medicines, I've been using them for more than 20 years in some situations, so they should be assessed. But no, you're not allowed to study them. And the GP should be allowed to open up offices, and also the freedom and independence of the media has to be reestablished, because now it's all in the hands of the government. So you have to do the opposite of what they've been doing for the past 25 years. It won't cost any more, and it'll do away with the present situation of mismanagement. Next slide. So holistic and humanistic medicine as we want. Aristotle, who was the son of a doctor, and of course he was a student of Platon, and it's also the father of animal and human biology. And I'd like to finish with a huge thank you to the MEPs who are here full of integrity and courage. Virginie Jouron, Stasis Jakilianis, Christine Anderson, Ivan Sintik, and Rob Bruce. And let's hope for a renewal and hope for a democratic Europe.
Merci.
Thank you, Professor. As I said by way of introduction, we're honored to see you here. You did a great job summing up those 2 years of madness. We're still in the midst of it. As you can see, we're as active as can be, because now we're going to try to settle some scores. I think we're off to a good start. So now I'm going to open the floor for some question and answers. I already see that we have a couple of questions. Now's the time. Christian, I'm going to give you the floor, and then we'll have some question and answers. So thank you for being here. Thank you for your support here with Professor Perronne and all of you doctors who've been suspended. It's outrageous. There's no reason for you to be suspended at present. Thanks to the response confirmed by Genix Moll of the Pfizer lab. Now we've got to get hold of some good lawyers, and we have to sort this out in court.
Christian, si vous voulez.
Christian.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you so much for being here. I will try to be very short, because I'm sure many other people will want to ask more questions. I'm more interested about the PCR test. You were mentioning multiple times the issue of PCR test. And what we discover now, after we asked all these representatives of Pfizer, Moderna, and the European Commission, is the following. the Chinese government released a segment of the DNA of COVID on January the 11th. Not the whole DNA sequence, just a part of it. Immediately after, many companies created PCR tests based on the sequence released by the Chinese government. The CEO of Moderna acknowledged on record after I asked them that they based their vaccine or injection, whatever, on that sequence released by the Chinese government. So my question is, do you know if the entire DNA data of COVID was fully decoded or not? That's first question. If the whole DNA sequence of coronavirus was decoded or not, and if so, when it was decoded and if it was published. That's the first question. Second question, specifically in regards to the PCR tests. If the PCR tests were based on the sequence released by the Chinese government, it's just a sequence, not the whole DNA data, is it possible that that sequence released by the Chinese data to match a sequence from other viruses, like flu or many other viruses that are out there? And could that be the reason why so many people who are not actually infected with coronavirus tested positive? Thank you.
So, je ne suis pas virologue. Donc...
I'm not a virologist, so it's not that easy for me to take a detailed response to that. But in coronavirus sequencing, there are sequences introduced. Most people agree. Professor Montagnier was one of the first to have said in France. So there's Professor Fortillon, who went to prison because in a film he dared to say that there were Institut Pasteur patents that changed SARS-CoV-2. I've seen the patents, one of my friends' names on them. So the Pasteur Institute said, well, yes, but it was just for researching an AIDS vaccine or malaria vaccine. So all those sequences were manipulated, not just in France. There were some in the US, patents too, and there were changes made funded by the Gantt function, by Anthony Fauci, that Robert Kennedy talks about in his book. So I'm not a virologist. I can't analyze all the sequencing, but it's likely that all the PCR tests were manipulated. Second question on, I've forgotten.
If the sequence or the part of the DNA data released by the Chinese government, if could, hypothetically speaking, match another sequence from a different virus.
Ah oui, avec les autres virus.
Yes, other viruses. Well, personally speaking, I don't have the knowledge to respond, but that may well have happened. But what concerns me at the moment, there was a terrible advert from the French Health Ministry today. They're developing combined vaccines, flu, COVID, and they're saying to all carers and everyone, for your protection, get the dual COVID flu vaccine. And what concerns me is that there are studies, they'll soon get a marketing permit for combined vaccines. And that would be rubella and mumps, so measles, and in France that's been obligatory for a long time for children, most children in most countries. So starting to vaccinate children on the basis of these things, all that causes cell damage. So there's lots of data to show that if you inject RNA, messenger RNA, then it changes the DNA. So we found this out at the end of 2020 with the first vaccines. I said, well, watch out. Normally you put the DNA chromosome into RNA and protein. In biology, an animal or human, sometimes you go from RNA to DNA. And that's the case of AIDS. It's a retrovirus, goes from RNA to DNA. But in humans, I don't know the numbers, but something like 20% of people have it in our genomes. Animal retrovirus RNA that goes back millions of years, and there are inverse transcriptors that go the other way, RNA, DNA. But I say, well, watch out, because you're going the other way, and people called me a charlatan, and I said that's in the 80s in the Pasteur Institute, and now it's been confirmed in the biggest medical journals that there are DNA copies from messenger RNA from the vaccine in human cells, in mitochondria even. So this big pharma wants to develop a new generation of vaccines for all, for a new generation of messenger RNA vaccinations, but that's criminal, because you should take 10 years before you release a new technology to set it up in the general population. So I hope that we'll be able to stop these madmen who have done a lot of damage in the population. And you shouldn't touch kids, I think.
Je crois que là-dessus, on est tous d'accord.
I think we all agree on that. No more questions, because we don't have much time. We've got we've got it here until 8:15. Who was next?
Thank you very much. If you allow me, I will make just a short testimony, because all of you here, and especially the people speaking, gave me the courage to make it. And I'm feeling very comfortable of doing it. My name is Marius Tudor. I am here in the position of an assistant, but I'm not affiliated anymore to a member of the European Parliament. Mr. Perronne, you said in your book that the one who says the truth must be executed. I am an assistant who was executed. First, because of my ethnicity, but second, because I was a strong believer that I have to fight for justice in our common fight against this invented virus and whatever vaccines they gave to us. My deputy marginalized me. He put me in a separate office just because I didn't want to get the vaccine. Mr. Terhes knows me very well. I'm a public figure in my country. I go to television, I write a newspaper, and I always had strong positions for what I have believed in. I didn't allow my children to vaccinate themselves. I didn't allow my wife to vaccinate herself. My children were marginalized in school by some Romanian MEPs from other political groups, those who supported these whatever vaccines. I even lost my job. I have left that office. And now I'm struggling to find another job. But I have left that office with dignity. And I have remained, in the eyes of my children, a hero. I just want to say that you should never give up on what you believe in, even if they call you a COVID idiot or a stupid. In the end, we were right, and we have won. And I would like to say this, especially to the MEPs. Anyone in this House would have been proud to stay by your side, even for free, just because this would have made them happy. And I include myself in this group. Congratulations. And since I'm a believer, I say, God bless all of you.
Thank you.
Merci beaucoup pour ce...
Thank you very much for that very touching message and sharing those words. That affects us all. We haven't got much time. Mr. Gay, please.
Oui, je voudrais faire une petite déclaration.
Just something I'd like to say by way of declaration, Chair, MEPs. It's great to be here with Christian Perronne, who is a friend, giving out information to the European Parliament. I'm Dr. Stéphane Gaillet, a GP infectiologist, and I teach at university hospitals too. Not just a whistleblower, Christian Perronne is particularly a doctor, a true doctor, a doctor who listens, who examines and cares for his patients without judgment and without scorn. And he gets tired, as we all do, but he tries to be kind and watch out for signs and symptoms displayed in his patients. He's a true clinician, a competent infectiologist. He's erudite and as objective as can be, although sometimes it's hard to be that in medicine. He's quite discreet and measured, but he's been told off for his communication. What he's being told is that having not stuck to the official doctrine of the health authorities. And doing that, he stands alongside many resistant doctors who are doing their utmost, particularly when they've been struck off like me. They're doing their utmost to understand SARS-CoV-2, this Machiavellian virus, unlike any other, and understand COVID-19, that often pernicious disease in some people. He's tried to understand this strange pandemic and find how to prevent and care for this disease, as with other scientists and doctors targeted, who are very lucid and who have resisted corruption and pressure and intimidation. Particularly, I'd like to single out members of of Reinfo COVID and so on, who have been banned and from the Health and Freedom Safety Collective. Christian Perronne understood very early on what was happening in France, in Europe, in the US, and in most countries throughout the world. I've been quite struck by his daring and his courage in saying very early on that it's criminal to say that hydroxychloroquine is ineffective in COVID-19. His 3 works on COVID have been very successful, deservedly so. They've given information and they have disrupted official information from our governments, according to which there was no curative treatment and the only options were lockdowns, masks, and washing your hands, and particularly being injected with messenger RNA vaccines to as many people as possible in as many countries as possible and as many times as possible. Those resistant have realized that the truth on the epidemic was the opposite of official doctrine across the board. Ex-Professor Luc Montagnier, before he died, God rest his soul, said, the unvaccinated are the guardians of humanity. He was also he also said that these preparations on RNA that have been tested. Now, I'm not going to say that, but terrible. I'm not going to go into all of that was said, but Professor Perronne is a guardian of medicine, medical science, true medicine, that listens and cares and doesn't just fall in line with what's going on. It's humanist medicine. Thank you.
Merci infiniment.
Thank you very much. That reference to Luc Montagnier, who was maligned recently, and thank you for quoting his last words, which affect us all.
Donc je remercie de
Thank you very much from the bottom of my heart to Professor Perronne and members. I've got a very important question here for me and all French people because it's to do with France. But first, I'd like to present myself. I am an employee of the European Court of Human Rights in the Council of Europe. At the start of the vaccination period in March 2021, the first vaccination was decided upon after 3 weeks. The first person that died was 3 weeks later. We don't know why heart issues. So just to remind you, to send a letter to the Council of Europe asking for objective information about a similar scenario, copying in the European Court of Human Rights. I sent this letter, and I've been very much criticised for that. And then I had the honour of being called to the Vice Secretary of the Court of Europe because of taking part in the anti-COVID demonstrations saying that COVID vaccines are illegal, saying at the same time that I'm an employee of an international organisation. So I had a warning, 2 of 4 in my HR folder. I can't remember. But anyway, my question is to do with COVID, but it's very important to me because I have 4 children. I am happy enough to live here and send my kids to school in Germany, where there's just 1 obligatory vaccination for children. But I'm compassionate and I'm very worried for all French children who have been given 11 vaccines. So I'd like to know what you think about that, please. Thank you. Well, there's talk of vaccinations. They're not COVID vaccinations. I've always been a defender of vaccinations. I didn't doubt their quality until recently. Studies showed the benefit of many vaccinations given to children. When I was president of the vaccination committee, I was never in favour of obligatory vaccinations, but recommended. But under pressure, I co-signed a manifesto when there were lots of people that asked for obligatory vaccinations. I did it against my better judgment, but I don't have any specific ideas about how dangerous vaccinations are for children, because some of them protect against serious illnesses. But everything that Big Pharma's hiding, you don't know what's in a COVID vaccination. You may well have undeclared products in there. Even the European Medicines Agency has recognised that not all ingredients in the COVID vaccination are listed. So how can an agency recommend a product when they don't know what's in it? They say that themselves. So I do have doubts. Now, I think we need to be clear. I don't trust them anymore. We need proper audits of the content of vaccinations to win the trust of people back again. So I really doubt all of this. I wasn't a doubter before. In terms of our neighbour Germany, there's 1 obligatory vaccination there and 11 in France. Are you worried about that difference? So that's a question to MEPs. It's important.
Pardon. Il y a des pays où, soi-disant, c'est...
There are countries where apparently it isn't obligatory, but private companies make it obligatory. In America, it may well be a university which is private that obliges you to have a vaccination, not the state. So often there's not an official obligation, but there is a private one.
Parce que dans 5 minutes.
Just 1 moment, because in 5 minutes we won't have interpretation. Just 2 minutes for you.
Thank you. Just a very short comment on that. If you visit our website or any other organization that has been working for decades, analyzing, looking into the science behind the traditional vaccinations, as well as working now on the COVID-19 vaccinations, there's plenty of data showing that whatever we say, there is a risk attached to vaccination. I think we can agree on that. And when there's a risk, there needs to be a choice. And there are countries, you know, where there is no mandatory vaccination. There are children who live healthily without vaccination. So it would be high time to start, not only for COVID, but also for COVID, but all the other vaccinations, to start looking at control groups with no vaccination to start with, to be very pragmatic. So there's no answer. I'm not saying yes or no. This is not against vaccination. That might help. It's for choice. Thank you.
Merci. Merci.
Thank you.
Je souhaite juste remercier les
I would like to thank the interpreters who will be finishing now.
Et aussi la technique, je sais pas.
And the technicians, I don't know, they will be here still. We've got 15 minutes. And we will be taking a drink. So 2 questions, then we'll take a drink together and you can ask your questions then. But thank you all very much. Also, for organizational reasons, you got to go out with the assistants who brought you in.
Balisé. Et donc voilà, ne partez pas tout seul.
So don't just wander through the corridors on your own.
Donc, avant de laisser la parole à Martine Vonner, Valérie et Martine Vonner conclura et après on continuera les échanges autour d'un pot.
Bonsoir, mesdames et messieurs les députés. Je suis ravie de parler ici devant vous et je vous remercie pour tout le travail que vous menez pour nous tous. Je voudrais aussi dire bonjour à tous les soignants suspendus qui sont dans la salle. On a parlé des médecins. Je voudrais insister sur un point. On a évoqué les médecins suspendus, mais dans la salle, il n'y a pas que des médecins suspendus. Il y a des infirmiers, des aides-soignantes, des administratifs. Il ne faut pas qu'on les oublie. Alors, je suis là pour vous annoncer une nouvelle. Vous avez tous entendu parler des médecins qui, lorsqu'ils vous examinaient, vous disaient « dites 33 ». Et pourquoi il vous demandait de dire « dites 33 » C'est parce qu'il paraît qu'en disant cela, c'était suffisamment grave, le son était suffisamment grave pour qu'on puisse écouter vos poumons. C'est l'AENEC qui, en son temps, avait demandé cela. Eh bien, il y en a un qui dit 33, c'est Christian Perronne. Et je suis là pour vous informer que chez Albin Michel, ce 3e livre écrit par Christian va sortir. Il sera dans les bacs de toutes les bonnes librairies à partir du 3 novembre prochain. J'insiste sur les librairies, vous comprendrez peut-être pourquoi. De quoi parle ce livre? Alors, ces 33 questions auxquelles ils n'ont toujours pas répondu, rassurez-vous, je ne vais pas vous donner les 33 questions, mais en gros, c'est pourquoi le Covid-19 est-il si résistant? Les vaccins sont-ils tous aussi efficaces? Avec le recul, quel est le vrai bilan de la politique sanitaire en France? Pourquoi les polémiques ont-elles été aussi violentes? Comment se sont comportés pendant cette crise les laboratoires pharmaceutiques mondiaux? Sommes-nous condamnés à nous faire vacciner tous les 6 mois? Autant de questions auxquelles vous trouverez des éléments de réponse. Et comme nous allons tout doucement vers le mois de novembre et que Noël arrivera très vite, je pense qu'au lieu d'offrir à nos proches, à nos amis, à nos voisins, des objets qui ne leur serviraient à rien, pensons à tous les livres de ceux qui sortent à cette période pour leur ouvrir les yeux et les oreilles. Merci bien.
Merci pour cette présentation. Madame Vonner.
Merci beaucoup. Alors, je me prends à rêver si seulement il y avait eu un moment de débat comme nous venons d'avoir maintenant. Grâce à vous, alors je ne suis plus parlementaire, j'étais parlementaire en France, mais vraiment merci à vous, les parlementaires, qui osez poser des questions auxquelles vous avez parfois des réponses totalement édifiantes. Merci de mener de façon aussi efficace cette commission Covid. Je voulais juste rappeler qu'en effet, en France, moi, je n'ai jamais non plus été anti-vaccin, comme mon confrère, le professeur Perronne. Maintenant, je me pose aussi également énormément de questions sur les vaccins classiques. Peut-être rappeler qu'en France, en 2018, Agnès Buzyn a imposé, en effet, a porté une loi pour que les 11 vaccins obligatoires rentrent dans la loi. Mais j'ai voté cette loi. Pourquoi ? Parce qu'il était prévu que ces 11 vaccins soient maintenus de façon obligatoire simplement 3 ans. Une fois de plus, le gouvernement actuel de M. Macron avait menti. Et aujourd'hui, en effet, j'avais pu reposer cette question dans la commission d'enquête Covid à laquelle je participais. J'avais posé la question au gouvernement. Devant moi, il y avait le Premier ministre. Il a simplement ricané en disant « Mais vous, les parlementaires, vous n'avez qu'à refaire le travail. Mais maintenant, ces 11 vaccins vont rester définitivement inscrits dans la loi. » Donc, en effet, c'est ce que les enfants subissent en France. Et j'espère que ces paroles seront entendues par mes collègues français pour qu'ils reviennent, en effet, sur cette loi inique et terminer. Alors, Madame Joron, vous m'avez proposé de conclure. Je ne vais pas conclure parce que, merci, c'est à vous de le faire. Mais simplement dire à quel point la France est devenue un pays où soigner ou défendre, parce qu'on n'a pas évoqué les forces de l'ordre ou les pompiers, mais avoir autant de professionnels formés qui aujourd'hui, de façon complètement, j'allais dire incroyable, on a piétiné le droit du travail en France et tous ces professionnels n'ont absolument plus de quoi vivre puisqu'ils n'ont plus de travail, ils n'ont plus de salaire, ils n'ont pas le droit au chômage, ils n'ont pas le droit au congé, ils n'ont droit à rien. Tout ceci est profondément scandaleux. Merci.
Merci beaucoup pour ce témoignage. Je crois que votre collègue à côté veut aussi s'exprimer. Allez-y. Est-ce que vous pouvez parler anglais ou non?
Je peux parler en anglais aussi, mais je peux parler en allemand.
Ah, en allemand, qu'est-ce que vous... En anglais?
No, I was just suggesting it might have been more beneficial for all in the room if you spoke English, but if you then just continue in French, that's fine.
OK. Donc, je voudrais d'abord dire que je suis vraiment très, très heureux d'être parmi vous parce que ça me donne de l'espoir. Et je voudrais vous remercier énormément, le professeur Christian Perronne et les députés européens très courageux. C'est magnifique le combat que vous menez parce que on se retrouve sur les mêmes valeurs et vous faites avancer la cause. Et j'étais très, très content des révélations que ça mène maintenant à une enquête du parquet européen. Parce qu'on a parlé beaucoup des soignants suspendus. J'ai envie de rajouter quand même encore des détails. Ce sont des gens dont on a cassé l'intégrité professionnelle. Ils doivent avoir leur salaire depuis plus d'1 an maintenant. Ils n'ont plus de salaire, donc ils sont dans la précarité. Tous les 2 jours en France se suicident 3 soignants. C'est vraiment honteux. Et d'après les révélations magnifiques que vous avez pu établir, normalement, ils devraient être réintégrés tout de suite, sans jugement, sans verdict, parce que tout est faux. La loi du 5 août se base sur des données frauduleuses et c'est l'escroquerie. Moi, je suis enseignant, je suis suspendu actuellement parce que j'ai laissé le choix aux élèves de porter le masque ou non. Donc, j'étais content aussi que vous parliez beaucoup des enfants parce que ce qui est le plus cher, on ne doit pas toucher aux enfants, c'est quelque chose qui nous tient à cœur et nous devons, coûte que coûte, protéger les enfants, empêcher l'éducation nationale de revenir à des formules qui sont de la promotion mensongère d'une injection et surtout ne pas revenir au masque qui n'a aucun sens. Les enfants en souffrent émotionnellement et physiquement. Toutes les études le prouvent, vous les connaissez. Et j'étais scandalisé de voir qu'on a muselé tous les enfants, tous les élèves. Il faut qu'on porte ce message haut et fort à tous les enseignants, tout le monde, qu'on a protégé avant tout les enfants.
Merci infiniment pour ce message. Effectivement, les enfants, c'est ce qui nous concerne tous. Et comme vous avez vu, nous sommes en ordre de bataille au sein de cette commission Covid. Mais j'ai envie de dire, j'aime pas conclure, hein, je pense que je vous laisserai la parole, j'ai horreur de ça. Mais c'est pour dire que si nous sommes là, c'est juste parce qu'à un moment donné, vous avez cru en nous. Et moi aussi, j'ai cru en professeur Perronne dès le départ, parce que pour moi, ça a été un phare dans cette pénombre. Et je me suis dit, si lui, il y va, on y va. Et c'est important parce que, comme vous avez vu, à un moment donné, vous êtes isolé, vous êtes seul, vous dites, est-ce que je suis seul à penser cela? Et vous avez besoin de partager. C'est ce que nous faisons ce soir. Et c'est très important. En tout cas, vous pouvez compter sur nous. Vous avez la meilleure équipe ici dans cette commission spéciale Covid avec Madame Limer qui va peut-être conclure. Hein, et je tiens encore vraiment à vous remercier. Vous êtes très nombreux. J'ai dû effectivement limiter l'accès au Parlement. Je regrette qu'il n'ait pas pu venir. Mais comme vous avez vu, tout est restreint, que ce soit l'accès, que ce soit la capacité. Et j'espère quand même vous retrouver encore une fois avec peut-être d'autres compatriotes d'autres nationalités. On pourra peut-être refaire et organiser ce type de conférence parce que nous sommes qu'au début de cette bataille. Nous avons ouvert la voie juridique et le chemin, je pense, va être très long. Madame Limer.
Pour dire sur ce que monsieur a évoqué, pour dire que justement avec Virginie Geron, nous avons rencontré une association des mamans louves qui se battent merveilleusement, ces 3 jeunes femmes qui se battent merveilleusement justement. Et qu'on ne lâche pas l'affaire justement et on va se battre avec elles parce que contre tous les effets délétères qu'ont subis les enfants et notamment la chose dramatique qui s'est produite d'enfants de moins de 10 ans qui se suicidaient suite au port du masque. Et pour vous dire que c'est un dossier qu'on suit également.
Merci Annika. Madame Limer, pour conclure.
Yeah, unfortunately, I was not able to follow the last year because I'm not able to speak French. But I just want to bring something to the attention of the audience here, which I deem is very important. And it is that today, EMA recommended the vaccinations for 6-month-old babies. And I think, and I really think what is really most important for us all here is that we go back to, and this is, we talked about a lot of pharmaceutical companies. I think this is half of our problem. But the biggest problem we do have is how our regulatory authorities work. And I think what we have to go back, and we really have to go back to, is that the patient safety is first. And therefore, we will prepare an objection against the regulatory authorization for Moderna and the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccinations because we think there has to be a lot more data and this is not the way we should play with the well-being of a lot of people here. Thank you.
Merci Madame Limer. Je vais faire court. Elle disait aujourd'hui, je pense que tout le monde a compris, que l'EMA a autorisé la vaccination pour les 6-5 ans, ce qui est dramatique. Et que...
6 mois, à partir de 6 mois.
6 months. 6 mois, c'est ce que je viens de dire. 6 months. Voilà. Voilà. Aujourd'hui, donc, on a cette dernière nouvelle. C'était une nouvelle qui était dans les tuyaux aux États-Unis, où ils ont fait la demande, effectivement, c'est Pfizer, d'avoir l'autorisation de vacciner les enfants de 6-5 ans. Et donc maintenant, c'est autorisé. Donc, ce que me dit Madame Limer, c'est que nous, notre travail, puisqu'on a l'accès à l'EMA, qui est donc l'Agence européenne de médicaments, de contrôler ces autorisations, qui sont, pour le coup, pour la plupart des vaccins, ont été ils nous ont pas assez de données de data, comme on dit, ou de données. Qu'est-ce que je voulais... Oui, donc il est tard, je crois. Donc je crois que... Pour conclure, donc, c'est sur le pot de l'amitié. Voilà, c'est tout ce que j'ai à vous dire. En tout cas, merci encore. Un petit verre. On échange encore. On est encore là 10 minutes. Et puis, merci encore de votre présence et de votre soutien. C'est très important pour nous.